I finished a cosplay in 3 weeks. Armor, props, LED, I made it to the con, and within the first hour, it started falling apart. For the last 3 weeks, I compressed an entire build of Steiner from Final Fantasy IX. Armor, electronics, props, into a timeline that was probably unrealistic. I hit the deadline, but once you're on the convention floor, it doesn't just matter how it looks, it matters how it works.
So I'm here at Fan Expo, and my cosplay is pretty uncomfortable, and it's falling apart. So I've got some lessons to learn about making sure that your cosplay actually stays together properly.
There's a difference between building something and having it hold up under movement, fatigue, sweat, cords, hours of wear in the real world. Unfortunately, rather than focusing on function and wearability, I just focused on getting it done. I slept for only 2 hours and I didn't have time to print and paint certain parts of the armor. So those parts were done with EVA foam, a skill set prior to this that I had never had any experience with. I still had to build a mace for Vivi, and I had to make a last-minute solution for my scabbard for Excalibur 2. There were a lot of moving parts and none of them felt optional. Somewhere in that compression, my thinking shifted. Instead of looking at the build as a connected system, how everything attaches and moves, how it's worn, I started just clearing tasks. And that shift is where the problem started. At the con, everything hadn't been fully integrated, and that showed up right away. The armor started separating, and taking it off was way harder than I expected. Getting into it felt like the milestone, and once it was on, I thought I was done. But at an event, you need to be able to move around, sit down, adjust, maybe take parts off quickly. And when I tried, I realized just how dependent everything had become. The chest piece came off easily, but I had attached the lower and upper hip armor to it with leather straps and Chicago screws. So once I was in, I was committed. It felt like I had built a trap around myself. I also relied way too heavily on Chicago screws in high flex areas. It really did not take long for those screws to start just popping out. At one point, the lower part of the chest armor completely came apart and I had to stitch it back together. It was literally hanging on by a thread. I could still use the bathroom though, and I felt like that was a win. The helmet kept shifting the entire time. It slid back and forth, eventually hit the floor, and the mount that holds the feather eventually broke off and I wasn't able to use it for the rest of the time, which is a huge issue because Steiner's silhouette is almost defined by this feather. The helmet stayed on fine during quick tests, but what I hadn't tested was how it behaves on top of the chainmail coif. Afterwards, with some research, I learned that chainmail is not usually worn with a helmet unless there's some sort of chin strap mechanism. And this isn't super obvious in game design, but it was definitely obvious once it hit the floor. The sword LED cable was so annoying. It was tangled constantly. Visually, it looked okay for a newbie, but once I was moving through crowds, turning, adjusting my grip, the cable just kept wrapping around everything. I had to manage it every few minutes, and whenever someone wanted to take a photo, I couldn't just pose. There was this wire that was in the frame or pulling tightly on my hand, so I couldn't really do any sort of sword swaying motions in a pose. I hadn't built a dedicated battery system into the sword, so I relied on a power bank and an external cable, and it powered the LEDs, it just wasn't integrated correctly. The scabbard was another rush decision. I assumed that I could just throw something together quickly, but what I didn't account for was the weight distribution. Based on Steiner's design, the strap goes over his pauldron, and that doesn't really make sense if your pauldron is moving around every time you move your arm overhead. So I just ended up holding the sword the entire day, which defeats the point of a scabbard. And the gorget. The only solution I had here was to use a Chicago screw to literally screw it on, which means I was screwed into it while wearing the armor. That became a pattern. Several connection points just weren't made for repeated motion. The pauldrons were another example of something that I just couldn't figure out how it would work on regular armor. I used Velcro and no-sew glued directly to my shirt. Technically, it held fine, but it was a temporary solution. My partner ran into similar issues. The mask reduced visibility quite a bit. In short tests at home, it wasn't really an issue, but with the chaos of the con and feeling like we had to move everywhere quickly, it just became a huge pain and she couldn't see through it. So eventually she ended up taking off for the entire con. And that was a big issue because the mask is a huge part of Vivi. The mace that I made actually looked pretty great. I didn't have a lot of time to post-process it, but in the end, the problem was actually that it was too heavy or just didn't have the right weight distribution for a prop to carry all day, especially for her size. None of these failures were really that dramatic on their own. One delicate part can be manageable. A lot of cosplays have a delicate component to it. But once you start stacking all of these temporary solutions together, you really feel it in every movement as it starts to feel risky just moving around. And I think that unfortunately can really affect your experience at a con and make you feel uncomfortable the entire time. But when I look back at those 3 weeks, the problem didn't start at the con. They started much earlier in how I allocated time. The early stages feel really productive. Modeling, painting, just bringing everything together and having physical parts. Visible progress just feels good. You can point to that and say that's done. But integration is a different kind of work. It's testing fit, reinforcing stress points, wearing the armor around the house first and noticing what shifts and rubs and starts to come loose. It's watching how the pieces interact once they're all moving together. That kind of work is slower. It doesn't look as impressive on a table, and when you're up against a deadline, it's easy to convince yourself you'll get back to it later. As the clock got tighter, my focus narrowed. I wasn't stepping back to make sure everything connected and worked together. Instead, I was just trying to make sure everything was finished. Most of my energy just went into making sure each piece existed. I didn't ask questions like, how long would I realistically be wearing this? Where would the stress build up? How quickly could I repair something on site? Or how would I get out of it if I needed to? I hadn't fully mapped out the attachment points before modeling either, which could have saved me a lot of headaches if I just put some time into thinking about that. Those questions don't slow you down in the moment. They just show up later. The last 24 hours were just about pushing through. I got 2 hours sleep, and when you're that tired, you just choose the fastest solution. You stop pulling on loose threads and everything just has to be good enough. So the con didn't reveal any random flaws. It revealed where I traded integration for completion. A few days after the con, I got the flu. 3 weeks of compressed work, almost no sleep, walking around in armor all day and being surrounded by thousands of people, it's not really surprising. I felt fine in the moment, but once everything stopped, my body crashed. I didn't burn out mentally. I was still motivated to keep going, but physically, I pushed past what was physically sustainable. And looking back, I don't really have any regrets finishing it. I'm glad I did. But I treated the deadline like the finish line, and in reality, the event was the test. The con showed me where my build was weak, and getting sick showed me where my pacing was weak. And I did finish it in 3 weeks. And next time, I want to feel finished in more than just the photos.